Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 3 books. Something old, something new. I don't have anything for something borrowed other than this tired old concept of old, new, borrowed, and something blue. Although not as blue as these 2 Fitzcarraldo books. But anyway, so the first is Counternarratives by Keene. I say something old because I have a long relationship to this book, which has sat on my TBR pile for a long time. So I first saw the cover and therefore the title, because that's all you get, through a window of a bookshop. The bookshop was closed. I thought, oh, that's an interesting title, because narrative is everything to do with fiction. And when eventually I got home that night, I couldn't remember what it was called or who the author was, and it went from my mind. But then I saw it again in another bookshop, and there wasn't that much about it. But I so liked the name Counternarratives, I bought the book and read the blurb, and the blurb on the back is not that informative. It seemed to me to be counter-narratives strictly from a historical viewpoint, i.e. historical counter-narratives. And as most of you know, my degree is in history. I have a very jaded palate for all things historical fiction. I'll leave a link to my video talking about it. So it's just sat on my to-be-read pile for ages. And I can't remember exactly why I picked it up a couple of weeks ago. I'd read quite a few books that were sort of reflexive investigations into the notion of fiction and autofiction and memoir, but were all definitively fiction, because I wouldn't read memoir, not interested in it. So it was very much sort of having a look at that genre, turning it inside out and on its head. And I just wanted something, I suppose, a bit of a palate cleanser. Although why a book I imagine to be historical narrative, an investigation into that, would be strictly a palate cleanser, I'm not sure. Anyway, I can't recreate my thinking as to how I got, but I picked it up. And lo and behold, I was really pleasantly surprised, because despite the blurb only mentioning the word once, these counter-narratives are slave narratives. From Brazil, obviously the Deep South in the US, but also Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. And then we move from the treatment of slaves into the treatment of Afro-Americans as freedmen. And their treatment initially is no better, really. There's a really interesting story about sort of the formation of the first sort of balloon corps, hot air balloon corps in the military, which is the Unionists use, and a free man from Philadelphia, was it Philadelphia? I can't remember, one of the northern cities, is fascinated by he's self-taught, he's very erudite. He's fascinated by all sort of things science, and attends lectures and things, and he meets this white scientist. And who gives him his card, which is obviously a very unusual thing at the time. And eventually he decides that he's going to seek this guy out, because this scientist has gone to help set up the first military balloon corps. And the treatment of this Afro-American is one notch above slavery. He's not allowed to do anything. He's really only there to serve the drinks and fetch and carry. I mean, it really makes you think and reacquaints you with, well, Afro-Americans in the North, in the supposed free North, were a little better than the indentured slaves down in the South. So that was a really interesting story. And then we get stories about a musician, not a blues musician, but someone who produced and wrote the first black musical in America. And it's a really interesting... what's come before has been sort of historical narratives, as implied by the title. So it's, the writing is not astounding, but it gets the job done. It conveys the messages it wants to convey. When we talk about this musical composer, he's absolutely persecuted by these sounds inside his head that he must get out on paper on musical scores, and that was how he worked. And I did think that was brilliantly written, and in a way took us in a whole new direction of my estimation and admiration for John Keene. In a way, I felt, well, it's a pity he couldn't have written the earlier, fairly straight-laced narratives in this sort of more interesting way. We get Jim from Huckleberry Finn, now freed, a sort of speculative story about him going back and meeting the boys again as a free man, and they're, you know, how they react to him. We get a story of a man who's in the same circles as Langston Hughes. So there's this arc of slavery to freedom in name only, to actual sort of freedom to create, to be an artist, to have true liberty of thought and mind. As I say, I was knocked out by this. I thought it was really not what I was expecting, although I'm not sure what I was expecting. I gave it 5 stars, but I do think there's that sort of split between the sort of fairly prosaic writing of the slave narratives, even though he's presenting narratives of resistance and sort of snatched self-empowerment, snatched self-expression. But the writing there didn't leap off the page like it did in some of the more, when he's sort of investigated the more sort of truly free minds to create. So 5 stars. And on to something new, the latest book by Mathias Enard, called The Annual Banquet of the Gravediggers Guild. And I love Mathias Enard. I have not read a bad book by him, and this is not this is another 5-star read, despite the fact that it's basically set in contemporary rural France. So Michel Houellebecq, who's another author I very rarely am disappointed by. His last fiction work was called Serotonin, and again was set in rural France, and just how difficult it is, but it didn't engage me because I'm not really interested in pastoralism. I'm not interested, even contemporary French pastoralism, because obviously the French countryside is in a hell of a mess. It's basically propped up by EU subsidies. It's still a huge proportion of the French economy, or at least French employment, is in the countryside. But it's in decline. It's suffering out all sorts of pressures. And yet in here it's done engagingly, whereas with the Houellebecq, I wasn't engaged. So it starts off the first section where an ethnologist who's doing a PhD in sort of contemporary rural France is going to do a year's worth of field work in this sort of village to the west of France, near the Vendée, just outside of there. And he's a great voice is created, Enard creates for him. He's sort of quite self-deceptive, ideas above his station, quite delusionary, delusions of grandeur, all this sort of stuff. And it's a great voice, it's very funny. And then he takes a rather bold decision whereby he then moves into slightly more third-person viewpoint from some of the people that he's engaged with, rather than him. We don't really hear his voice that much at all from then on until the very final section where we return to that first-person voice, which is quite a brave decision, but it's really interesting because we do get a sense of the French countryside, and we also get a sense of the historical dimension of the French countryside, because this is a book about life, death and renewal. And obviously the sort of the cliched view of the countryside of seasons and death and renewal of crops and all of that stuff. He introduces the element here of, or the idea here of sort of a karmic wheel, where we are, when people die, they are reborn into other life forms, be it animal or vegetable or human. So we get a viewpoint of the whole of the sort of history of the French countryside, or this portion of the French countryside. So, for example, the parish priest, who is sort of struggling, with the worldly temptations. When he dies, he gets reincarnated as a boar, and we follow this boar. The boar isn't really given that much, it's not sort of anthropomorphism. We're not inside the boar's head that much, but the boar keeps cropping up in the environment for some of the existing human characters. So through this rather ingenious use of comic wheel and the bardo, which is obviously ideas we've encountered before in other people's works, we get this sense of time, and we get the sense of humans are deluded if they think they are not subject to the same seasonal pressures of birth, death, and renewal. Not in the sense of it's not the individual who's renewed, even though in some senses they are because they're getting reborn, but in the sense of the life that human beings in these types of places inhabit. It is a reproduction. It is a repetition through the ages. That life doesn't move on. Life doesn't change all that much. Yeah, the technology may make one or two things easier. But, you know, the stores are disappearing in the city. There's only a bar left. Is the only business outside of farming. So that mankind is on the same treadmill as nature. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. And then we come to the centrality of the book, which is the banquet of the Gravediggers Guild. So the mayor of this village is also the chief gravedigger, and he has 3 men working under him. And every year they hold an annual banquet for gravediggers and associated death industry personnel from all over the country. And it is ostensibly, they say that no one dies in this period because all the gravediggers are gathered in this, you know, this great feast, so that death gives them a 3-day furlough effectively, or gives the human race a 3-day furlough. And there are philosophical speeches, but really it is about gluttony, gastronomic, over the top, gourmandising. Being French, we get a long list of the dishes that they're eating, and you get this real sense of, you know, these are French dishes. They've come from the countryside. All the produce has come from the countryside. Of course, France with its wonderful cuisine and its tradition of feasting. This is, you know, this is brilliantly. Now, normally I find that very boring. You know, I'm not interested. I'm not a gourmand. I'm not interested in it. But again, it is so brilliantly executed by Enard. You know, it is over the top. It is a sort of riotous and excess, and in a way you could be morally appalled by it. But he pulls it off. He absolutely pulls it off. It's a bit of a standalone section for the rest of the book, because yes, we've got this mayor, chief gravedigger of the village, presiding over it, but it doesn't really feed into the rest of the book other than the themes of death, which it does. And then we come to the final section. I don't really want to give too much away for spoilers, but our ethnographer, who's been struggling increasingly to do the work, to interview the city, you know, the villagers and gather data and all of that, and he's been absorbed by the countryside. He's, you know, he is a Parisian, a proud Parisian, an urbanite, and he's been turned. He's been absolutely turned and converted. It's just fabulous from beginning to end. 5 stars. And on to my third 5-star read, which is Amin Maalouf. I should say that was translated by the annual banquet of the Gravediggers Ball was translated by Frank Wynne. So Amin Maalouf is of Lebanese origin, but now resident in France. And this was translated from the French by, I wish they put it somewhere obvious. Oh, also by Frank Wynne. So there you go, 2 French translations by Frank Wynne. And the genius of this book is its structure. So it's set in Lebanon in the 70s initially, where a group of university friends, you know, hang out together all the time. They're of all creeds and ethnicities, and you know, they're, despite their diversity, they are really a tight-knit group until the civil war breaks out in Beirut, and then they are, you know, blown asunder literally. Some go into exile, some join the militias, some are innocent victims of the violence, some. There's a brilliant sort of story where one of them is so driven, he's stayed in Beirut, but he's so driven to despair by the situation that he's going to commit suicide. And he's walking home, having sort of finished all his preparations and seen to his affairs, with the intention of killing himself, when he's snatched off the street because there was a lot of kidnappings for ransom by all combatants during that combat, and he can't commit suicide because he's being held captive. And of course, the people holding him captive can't make him do anything because he doesn't care. There's no stakes in. If they kill him, that's what he wants anyway. And they realise this, and it's a brilliant sort of inversion. But the structure I was talking about is the book opens with a phone call to the main character, who is Lebanese Christian, has fled to Paris. He's a professor of history, ancient history, and he's received a phone call from one of the circle's wives. She was also in the circle. She was called Tanya, who's informed him that Mahoud, who he has bitterly fallen out with, not spoken to for many years, is at death's door from natural causes, and has asked to talk to him for a final time. So he's persuaded to go back to his old country for the first time in 30 years. And although he gets there, it's not in time because Mahoud has died, but the wife really appreciates that he came over. So he's passing on his consolations, and she makes mention that she would like to get those of the gang who are still alive back together for a meeting, to meet up again. It's kind of, it would honour her dead husband. And he thinks this is a very good idea, so he starts reaching out by email and stuff. So the beginning of the book is we get each of these other characters in the circle, we get their stories, And it's very simple, but it's very elegantly and efficiently done, I think, to introduce us to this sort of whole role of characters. And that sets up the book's themes of exile, migration, identity, Arab history, revolutions, liberation theory. It's just really, really beautifully done, in the sense of you're not being spoon-fed, you're not being hit over the head. You've got all these different viewpoints and takes on these things anyway. So it's a fairly even-handed treatment of these subjects. So I'm just going to give you a couple of readings from it, short readings. My friends belonged to all denominations, and each made it a duty, a point of pride, to mock his own, and then gently those of the others. We were a sketch of the future, but the future would forever remain a sketch. Each of us allowed himself to be escorted under guard back into the fold of faith. We proclaimed ourselves disciples of Voltaire, Camus, Sartre and Nietzsche. We called ourselves surrealists. We went back to being... we called ourselves surrealists. We went back to being Christians, Muslims or Jews, according to precise denominations, an extensive martyrology and the pious hatred that goes with it once the war broke out. For years now I've been waking up with two conflicting feelings, joy and sadness. Joy because I've made a success of my profession. I've earned a lot of money. I have a beautiful house and a contented family life. But sadness too, because my people are in the depths of despair. Those who speak the language I speak, those who profess the same religion, are everywhere derided and often despised. Since birth I have belonged to a vanquished civilization, and since I am not prepared to renounce it, I must live with that mark on my forehead. Now, I read this a week before what's broken out in Israel-Palestine happened, and having read this book, it couldn't be more timely. Yes, this is about sort of the Lebanese identity, but that notion of those who speak the language I speak, those who profess the same religion, are everywhere derided and often despised. Since birth I have belonged to a vanquished civilization, which really made me think, because obviously I've been born into Britain, which, has a long period of sort of colonial domination, world domination, in that it owned, a third of the globe at the height of its empire and stuff. We've never been invaded, certainly not in my lifetime. Yes, there were 2 world wars and obviously the Second World War and Britain was won, but basically it's not lived a history of abject defeat and being vanquished, like has been described in here. But as I say, you know, this book was stupendous in the week I read it, and then the next week we're back in the situation, and instead of it being Lebanon, or it could have been Syria, or it could have been Iraq, this time it's Israel-Palestine again. So yeah, I thought this was really, really skillfully handled, and the thing about it was, I thought the writing wasn't going to be that interesting. I thought the structure was all. The structure made it, and how he was then able to deal with the ideas. But actually, the writing is pretty good, to the extent that it's down there somewhere. I've gone out and bought his book Samarkand, which I shall probably get round to reading next year. His writing was engaging enough in and of itself. At times the character motivation teetered on a bit sort of by the numbers or sort of pop psychology, but he's sort of always managed to veer away from that, I feel. So yeah, 5 stars. So what a terrific reading week I've had, or not week, couple of weeks. Counternarratives by John Keene, 5 stars. The Annual Banquet of the Gravediggers Guild by Mathias, Enard, you know, usual 5 stars from the great man. And this, as I say, really pleasant surprise as well. Disoriented, which is a very clever pun, by the way. Disoriented, as in the Eastern sort of culture taken out of oneself through exile and things like that, by Amin Maalouf. So till next time, I hope to start Monsieur Cartarescu's Solenoid, but I woke up so tired today, I just couldn't. I felt I had to have a sort of greater sharpness of mind to start engaging with it. So I'm reading something else in the short term. But hopefully my next wrap up will include Solenoid. So till next time, thanks very much.